If I'm asking Niall, what does Judaism mean to you?
I'm Jewish and I'm pro-Palestinian. And I'm a leftist. I support Maduro and I support Hugo Chavez. I don't believe in a two-state solution. Jewish identity is the right to do what others have done. So others have done a genocide. We have the right to do a genocide.
I got a lot of flack
during
my interview with John Philpott about Quebec sovereignty and the fact that, you're saying Quebecers are colonized, but at the same time, what happened to the First Nation people here?
If you're for Palestine, why aren't you for the natives?
That's what scares the West, by the way, is that they don't want First Nation people, regardless where, to resist.
It was this idea that we're not free until we're all free.
What's that justice system that's trying to tell me what I should be doing? They didn't do anything. I had to fight for my life. My whole family was destroyed. And they're going to come and tell me, oh, well, you did this wrong? Well, look at these people. I mean, they stole my land. They stayed there for 100 years. They killed over 9 million Algerians.
The extreme right, where they have their biggest bastions in France, is because of the Pieds Noirs. Is because the Pieds Noirs never went through a process of understanding, hey, yeah, we were the bad guy. But then after being the bad guy, what happens? I didn't talk about this. I never talk about this in my interviews.
When I reached out to Independent Jewish Voices, I was actually pleasantly surprised that they chose you as the member that's going to be on the interview. And
I'm all over the place.
Yeah, exactly. No, the reason is because maybe a week or two prior, I had a senior interview on Radio Canada. You were doing an interview, I think, regarding the university protests.
Yep.
And it was like two segments. There was the pro-Israeli camp and the protests camp. And I was really impressed with your answers, to be honest with you.
Thanks.
And upon doing some more research, and not to put you on the spot here, I was pretty impressed with your background too. I mean, you hold a degree in sociology, in political science, in law. You're a member of Independent Jewish Voices, and you're a union activist. Yeah. So, before we go into the details of this interview, I would like you to share about your personal journey to help us paint a picture of who you are.
Yeah. Well, actually, first of all, thanks for having me on. I'm kind of blushing now because you put me on the spot with regards to all of that. So I hope I live up to the hype. I hope I live up to the hype in this podcast. Funnily enough, I was on another podcast back in November, which is called Québec au pluriel. Great project about Quebecers from all different backgrounds by a journalist who is a student at UQAM, and she basically is half French, half Quebecoise, and grew up in France and had big identity crisis in France because she was always felt like she was Quebecoise, and then when she came to Quebec, well, she didn't really feel like she fit in. And so she does all of this series about basically Quebecers from all different backgrounds, and she invited me to come on to the podcast. So there's a whole podcast where we talk about 1 hour about my background and about all of my life experiences and stuff like that. But here I'm going to do it pretty short. I'm obviously Jewish, a member of Independent Jewish Voices. On my father's side, we're Sephardim. Sephardis, which are from Portugal, Spain, North Africa most of the time. And on my mother's side, we're Ashkenazi. And I say it, very openly that I'm Jewish, but I didn't grow up in a religious household. And I think that sometimes that is difficult for people to understand, that you can say that you're Jewish and not necessarily go to the synagogue every Shabbos or, really participate in the religious aspect of things. So I grew up in a very, very secular household. My family in Portugal, they go back, hundreds of years in Portugal, right? Basically, we believe that our family came from Spain, where a bigger Jewish community was and were expelled from Spain, right? Basically at the end of the 15th century. And so they came to Portugal. A lot of Portuguese Jews actually come from villages on the border of Portugal and Spain, because the trade-off was, well, you can come to Portugal, we'll give you a safe haven, but you have to protect the border against the Spaniards. So you have a lot of villages actually right on the border that are all Jewish villages, and a lot of these villages till this day have what we call New Christians, or what we call Moranos. Moranos is kind of more a pejorative term, but it's a term sometimes that's used, which are Jews, which are, I don't like the term crypto Jew because it feels like you're coming out of a cave or something, but crypto Jews, so Jews that kind of lost touch, quote unquote, because of, you know, Inquisition, oppression, etc., anti-Semitism, with their Jewish faith. And so that's basically my father's side. And why it's important is because my father reconnected with his Judaism in the 1970s. My father's kind of older, and so he went to Israel in the 1970s. And when he got to Israel, you know, he's from the hippie generation a little bit. And when he went to Israel, he went to the Kibbutz. Kibbutz was a big thing in Israel back at the day. And he right away felt that he was out of place because he wasn't what people expected him to be as a Jew, right? And so basically my dad taught me about all of this when I was growing up, told me a lot of the stories about his experience in Israel. And when my dad leaves in the early 1970s, he basically sits in the apartheid regime already at the time, right? Then he comes to Canada and does all of that. So, I mean, I grew up in a family that's very secular, always been very pro-Palestinian. My mom has always been very pro-Palestinian, and a family that didn't have this link, right? This like very, very strong link to Israel. So in many ways, not to throw flowers at myself, you know, I think it was easier for me in many cases to basically take the stance that I'm taking today, because I didn't grow up with all of that Zionist, very, very heavy narrative right within my family, and I didn't risk alienating, except maybe a few cousins here and there, anybody in my family that was very close to me, because I was pro-Palestinian, Jewish pro-Palestinian.
If you don't mind, I'd like to expand a bit on your father's experience in the kibbutz. And you said that he noticed that it was an apartheid regime. I mean, he told you stories. Could you give us a bit, just a brief context of what he lived actually there?
Yeah. So, I mean, my father's there, I guess, right after the 6-Day War. So 1967, when Israel occupies the remainder of historical Palestine, which is the West Bank and Gaza, and Golan Heights too. And so basically, my father gets to Israel in this very, you know, a moment where it seems with like, kind of like from our perspective today, where Israel was triumphant, right? There was this kind of feeling within Israeli society that they had won, and that, you know, now they were able to colonize all of Israel, all of historic Judea and Samaria, and all of the rest of historical, what they call historical Israel.
And also parts of Syria and Egypt.
Parts of Syria and Egypt and Sinai, exactly. Yeah, they took over the Sinai. And so I think my dad got there in this euphoric moment, and then realized that, wow, Israeli society is very racist. Israeli society is racist, obviously, towards Palestinians, but what my dad experienced was Israeli society was racist towards non-Ashkenazi Jews, right? And so when he gets there, this story that he tells me, that he's told me multiple times, is at one point they asked him, you know, well, are you, your name, because our last name Ricardo and his last names from his mother's side, Pinto Pereira, are very Jewish last names in Portugal. And they said, well, listen, we can give you Israeli citizenship, like Jewish. We can put on your ID card that you're Jewish, and so that comes with all of the privileges, right? And that's right there. That's apartheid, right? You have more privileges because you're Jewish. And my dad said, no, I'm not Jewish. Because at the time also, you know, there was this whole idea of secularism, right? He was like, I'm not Jewish, I am secular, right? Some people would say, well, you know, they weren't talking about being religious, they were talking about ethnic, and that's where, you know, it's a difficult thing to unmingle, right? This Jewish identity is much more than just a religious or an ethnic identity, right? But my dad felt very insulted because he felt that, you know, he had the right to be a citizen without having to be Jewish, right? And so basically they laughed at him. They said, well, if you don't want to be Jewish, which they took as an insult, right? Like if we're giving you the opportunity to have Jew written on your ID card, you better take it. Then we're just going to put you as a Catholic, which obviously is the most insulting thing that you can possibly do to a Portuguese Jew that has survived over centuries against under the Inquisition and stuff like that, right? So he explained that to me. He also told me that most people on the kibbutz were not Jewish. Quite surprisingly enough, most people on the kibbutz with whom he was, and I don't know if that was the thing all over, were a lot of young people that had this ideal of the kibbutz, which was this communitarian lifestyle, right? Where everybody would, cultivate, quote unquote, cultivate all of these myths after it was cultivating land that was already cultivated, but cultivate the land and give back and live in this community lifestyle. And so he told me that, there was a lot of Dutch people, a lot of Swedish, a lot of, all throughout Europe, but there weren't necessarily just Jews. And actually, he told me the majority of folks were non-Jews. He did talk to me about, young American Jews. There's a famous case of Bernie Sanders that went to the kibbutz and stuff like that. But those were, at least in his kibbutz in Galilee, were the minority. So it's interesting. And then after that, he left the kibbutz and he went to live a few years in Tel Aviv, and then after that in Jerusalem.
I'm going to interrupt you just for our listeners, because you're repeating kibbutz many times, and just to differentiate between the actual cities and the kibbutz. Can you tell us more what's a kibbutz so that they know?
Yeah, so the kibbutz is, and I might be wrong because I'm not an expert 100% on kibbutz, but the kibbutz came with all of this myth of making the desert flourish, right? This idea that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land, right? So the Zionist myth, very problematic myth, settler colonial myth, right, in many ways. And so the kibbutz were forms of collective farms, bigger than just farms, because you basically had production of pretty much everything on them, from olives to olive oil to fishing to, fruits, etc., that were supposed to produce the agricultural output of Israel. And here in Quebec, you would probably find it with co-ops. You have agricultural co-ops where agriculture, smaller agriculturalists or farmers get together and they create a co-op. So, I'm going to make wheat and you're going to have cows. And so we're going to transfer the wheat and the cow. Well, here it was all within a closed circuit, let's say, not 100% closed, because they would export, obviously, the surplus to the cities, but where everything within the community was shared amongst everybody. And so people had, my dad would tell me, some days he would be out there, in the olive groves, and then other days he would be fishing. And then so everybody had to partake in these different activities within the kibbutz, right? And most of the time it was, I guess they got some form of stipend from the government, but most of the time it was more or less volunteer work, in the sense that your stipend was kind of pocket money, but you would live and your whole life would be on the kibbutz, and you would be offered, lodging on the kibbutz, all of that. And it created a very close-knit community of people, right? And then my dad left, and he realized that going through, one of the experiences he told me about was going through Jerusalem East, and realizing that actually he got stopped a lot, because my dad is a lot darker than me. He could pass very easily for North African or Arabic in many ways. And he actually looks like the ex-Shah of Iran. That's actually a funny story. People thought that he was... When Reza Shah, when Reza Shah was in the hospital in the United States, people actually thought, nobody knew where he was, but they knew he was in North America. People would stop my dad on the street because they thought it was him. So anyways, he would get stopped a lot by the Israeli military and police, and in the occupied territories, the military, because they thought that he was Palestinian, right? And for a lot of Jews that come from, the Middle East and the Arab world, that's the reality. That was the reality in general, right?
And to get back to your personal journey, were you born in Montreal?
No, I was born in Toronto, unfortunately, but I lived a lot of my life in Europe. Mm-hmm. So I lived in Portugal, I lived in France, I lived in Belgium. I traveled a lot throughout Europe, and I only came back to Canada. I kind of leave Canada for the majority of my teenage years, and I come back at around 19, actually, to Montreal.
Okay. I mean, your French is excellent, though. You learned French in France?
I learned French in France at the beginning, yeah, and then I did all my studies here at UQAM. So yeah, I'm completely francophone, bilingual.
Okay. You say that you're a secular Jew, and you mentioned that your father refused the Israeli citizenship because he considered himself secular, not Jewish. I mean, if I'm asking Niall, what does Judaism mean to you?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, Judaism means for me kind of like all of the. I think it's interesting because I've actually reflected a lot on this, in the last few months, last few weeks, obviously. I think that despite the fact that I didn't grow up religiously, a lot of the lessons that are conveyed through religion were conveyed to me, So growing up, it was always very important to give back to the community. But it was always very important also to understand that we were all connected, to understand that social justice meant more than just, talking about it. It meant actually putting it into action. And I think that, one of the main lessons that my mom kind of taught me all the time was you get out of the world what you put in it. And so your duty is to put as much good into the world as you can if you want to have a good life, if you want to be somebody who, has happiness and joy in their lives, then you have to bring happiness and joy. You have to try to fight for the people that are suffering, that are oppressed. And so I think it was always, linked for me, my solidarity with Palestinians with my Jewish identity, right? I think that in many ways my political identity and my Jewish identity are very, very common, and I couldn't say what comes first in the sense that I think that my Jewish identity has been informed by my political identity, takes root in my political identity, but my political identity is 100%, because of all of the things that were brought up culturally as a Jew, through my family, right? And I think that, being in a minority position in Portugal for hundreds and hundreds of years, always under the threat of, expulsion. I mean, my family lived, through the Inquisition, but beyond that, they also lived, through a dictatorship, very brutal dictatorship in Portugal. And I think that put them in a very particular situation, For example, my aunt, who's kind of like my grandmother, never had children, one of the jokes we would always do was that we would come to her interphone at her apartment and we would pretend to be the secret police, like when we were kids growing up, because that was a common experience, like that she lived through, where, the PID, that's the name of the secret police in Portugal, they came several times to our apartment because my grandfather was active in the communist movements in Portugal, which was banned, outlawed by the dictatorship. And my dad was very active in student movements and the communist movement. Well, not directly the communist movement, but anti-fascist and movements against the regime. And I think that the fact that I never looked at it this way until I came to Canada. Actually, I kind of rediscovered my Jewish identity to a big extent, but in Portuguese society, we never talk about, these people are Jews, right? Because a lot of Portuguese society are converted Jews, like some of the biggest bank owners are called the Holy Spirit. That's the name of the family. That was the name of the bank. And they converted to Catholicism through the Inquisition, right? But they kept their faiths. A lot of these families kept their faiths. And it's known within Portuguese society which families are new Christians, which families are not new Christians, which families are part of, the old kind of Jewish stock, right? And I think that within the regime, or at least within the secret services, within all of that, it was known that we were a Jewish family. And that's kind of why maybe they cracked down on us even more, right?
Sorry, but are you implying that on papers you guys are Catholics, or no, you can display your Jewishness?
So so on paper, you're going to have, for example, baptisms, right? Like a lot of Jewish families are going to have to baptize their kids.
Oh, wow, okay.
You know, there's even this thing where, you know, Jewish families in Portugal, in that region that we're from, they have a very special, it's become a delicacy, which is a chicken sausage. And this chicken sausage is because when people would come into the house, you would put up the sausages. Normally sausages are made out of pork, right? And you would display them to show, listen, I eat pork. Obviously, I'm a good Christian. You know what I mean?
Wow.
So there's all of these things where it's like, yes, by the book, you do what you have to do to survive, but you have to keep your faith and you have to transmit that faith. And actually within our family, and it's something similar to Palestinians, I think, a lot, where the women within the family keep the key most of the times, you know. Within our family was the women. So my grandmother transmitted it to my aunt, and then my aunt transmitted it to me. I guess I'm not a woman, but, you know, maybe I'll have a daughter one day and maybe I'll be able to transmit it to them. But it's always been the women within these communities, within these families that have transmitted it. Yeah. So all that to say, I think that, you know, the way I view myself as a Jew is I cannot separate it from the political activism that I do, from the political, you know, from my solidarity with Palestinians, my solidarity with, you know, against fascism, against colonialism, because I think that is the biggest lesson. And this comes more from my mom's side, who are Ashkenazi, Eastern European, you know, and they obviously, you know, lived through the horrors of the pogroms, and we didn't directly live through the Shoah, but because they had already immigrated to England and Canada, but we were saved because of that immigration, right? We were saved because we could immigrate to England and stuff like that. And so to see Jews today kind of, you know, what is Jewish identity is a good question. I think it's a question we should ask a lot of Zionists. I mean, you know, is Jewish identity only the flag of Israel? Is it that? Have we gotten to the point where it seems sometimes in the media, you know, you hear the general discourses and it seems like Jewish identity is the right to do what others have done. So others have done a genocide, we have the right to do a genocide. Others have, you know, done apartheid, have expelled, have, you know, everything that was done to us can be done, we can do, because that's what we are. We have a nation state now, and I think that's completely antithetical to what Judaism is for me.
And that's what you use the word amalgame entre être anti-juif et anti-sioniste. Oh, c'est pas anti-juif. You said amalgame entre être anti-juif et anti-sioniste. So basically, they're conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on purpose.
Yeah.
Just to basically, everybody that's Jewish is supposed to be a supporter of the Israeli entity, whereas on your hand, for example, you're, I'm assuming, anti-Zionist because it's a political ideology, but you're a proud Jew, I'm assuming, from what you said, right?
Yeah. I mean, for sure. I think that people kind of forget that Zionism is a very, very recent project, right? And Zionism did not, even within its lifetime, always have the majority status that it had, you know, let's say, with the creation of Israel. And actually, I'm saying that I don't actually know if the belief of most Jews at the end of the Shoah was for there to be an Israeli state.
Just for our listeners, the Shoah, which is
the Holocaust.
Okay.
The mass murder, concentration camps, gas chambers, etc.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm sorry to cut you off. You said your mom came from Poland, I'm assuming, or
yeah. So my mom's family, you know, it's always difficult to trace back all the lineages, but yeah, my mom's family comes from what we believe to be at the time Poland, and then basically their ancestor's name was Clapham, and then Clapham becomes Clapham in England because it's an easier way. You know, Jews would change their names to kind of like try to fit in. And so I think that ancestor arrived at the turn of the 20th century in London, something around that time. And then after that, there was kind of like one first generation in England, and then the second generation comes to Canada, you know.
Yeah, and that position regarding Zionism pushed you, I'm assuming, to go towards the independent Jewish movement.
Yeah. So
okay, what happened exactly? Like, I mean, how does it happen?
I think I've always been, so I always was an anti-Zionist at heart. And I think it's kind of, you know, sometimes that term anti-Zionist is like, it's difficult, right? It's not necessarily the best term, because I think being anti something is not the end all be all, right? It's reductive, right? It reduces a whole very, very rich philosophy of Judaism that comes to be determined completely by Zionism, right? So it feels like now, you know, you say you're anti-Zionist, so you're anti that, but what do you actually believe in? And like, we believe in a lot of different things, right? I mean, you know, you look at the history of Judaism, you look at the history of what Jewish political thought for the longest time was, or radical Jewish political thought, something that, you know, Cornel West, for example, he'll call, you know, the prophetic Jewish tradition, right? Which is this idea from Karl Marx, you know, to Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg. You know, we could even talk about Ruth First, who was one of the main activists against apartheid in South Africa. It was this idea that we're not free until we're all free. Jews cannot be free until the system that keeps everybody oppressed is taken down completely, right? And so that's the tradition of anti-Zionism. But it's not anti-Zionism. It's much more than that, you know? It's an actual rich and wealthy political philosophy that kind of like permeates a lot of Jewish activism. And you look anywhere at any given time, you'll find Jews, right? That, you know, la guerre d'Algérie, a lot of people that were supporting not just French Jews, but also Algerian Jews, right? That supported Defalen, that did a lot of fought for independence for Algeria and Morocco. You have a lot of Jews that, you know, supported creating a republic in Morocco against the king. They wanted a democratic Morocco. You have Jews right across the world, right, that have, you know, participated in movements like that. So I think for me, to get back to the question at hand, I think for me it was, you know, I always felt that, and I didn't have a community. I think it can be very, very difficult not to have a community as a Jew. When you criticize Israel, it's, you know, the normal things, right? You're not really Jewish, right? When being Jewish, as I told you, you know, there's all these explanations, my family this, my family that, you know, this is what happened. But that's the story of all Jews, right? I mean, it's very rare for Jews. I don't think any Jew, right, has had one family name from the time of the destruction of whatever they call it, you know, of the Second Temple, all the way, you know, to today. Actually, Netanyahu is not Netanyahu's name, right? Like, Netanyahu changed his name a lot. Ben Gurion changed his name. It's called the Hebrewisation, right? They tried to Hebraize names. So this is a common thing. But people are going to come to you, not a real Jew. You didn't grow up, especially when you're not religious. Oh, you don't know anything about Judaism, as if Jewish religion condones genocide or condones the creation of the state of Israel or condones. Actually, a lot of religious Jews within the Hasidim community don't agree with the creation of the state of Israel because it's supposed to be when the Messiah comes, right? It's not supposed to be now, right? And I don't agree with that either, right? Because I don't agree with a theocratic religious Israeli state. But so I think I reached out to IJV probably 2016, 2017, and I met with Corey Balsam, who was a national coordinator. And at the time, you know, there was one staff member for all of Canada.
How many members are there now?
Now there's around, I think, across the country, I don't want to say something that's not 100% correct, but I think almost 2,000 members, maybe 1,700, something like that. Jews are not a huge community, right?
But I'm from 1 to 2,000, and you're saying less than 8 years. It's
Well, so it was one staff member. In terms of members, yeah, I mean, since October 7th, it's been an explosion. I mean, we have chapters now in New Brunswick and Saskatchewan. We have members in Yukon, all over Canada. There's chapters. The Montreal chapter is very, very active. You have a Vancouver chapter, you have a Toronto chapter, you have a Halifax chapter, and then you have the student chapters, right? And I think that is really what, one, allowed me to reconnect with my Jewish identity on a level that allowed me to really feel like, okay, I can be Jewish and I can be pro-Palestinian and I can be all of these things, and they're not in contradiction, they actually go together, and I can live that in a community with people that are like-minded. But it also allowed me to be proud and to have the courage to go and do and speak up. You know, I think it's very hard, and I commend a lot of people, you know, because there's more and more young Jews, and I think we're in a different we're in a different era than what we might have been previously. But it's very, very different now, let's say, than like just 30 years ago or maybe 20 years ago.
How different?
Different in the sense that I think within the Jewish community, it was a much harder stance to take. I mean, the war on terror completely, you know, for like me growing up, I think one of the biggest moments of my life was the war on terror, although I'm not Muslim, although I'm not from the Middle East or from a Muslim majority country. I think that it was a very, very important moment for me. And like you just saw through the war on terror, how everything Israel was doing to Palestinians was now being used against Iraqis, was being used against Afghanis, was being used this on a general level. You know, the suspicion, like you're an Arab, you're a Muslim, you're under suspicion all the time. And I think that, you know, in that period to say, well, you know, the Palestinian resistance are not necessarily all terrorists. You know what I mean? There are terrorist acts that can be committed by the Palestinian resistance against civilians, you know, but the resistance against military targets, for example, you know, and then you would be called a terrorist sympathizer. I mean, you're still called that today, but I think that people have been called that so much that people just don't go along with it anymore, right? And you know, you see it. Unfortunately, you see it in France a lot, where, you know, there's people like the name of the candidate I forget, but Rima Hassan, I think, was you know, called for apologie au terrorisme. You know, there's that, but I think that
Rima Hassan in France, right?
Yeah. I think that moment, so the elders within our movement, you know, the people that, you know, have carried IJV all of these years, in years of wilderness, in years where there were like one or two doing all of these actions, doing all of these activities, you know, they are the ones that we have to be grateful towards, because they are the ones that allowed us to be here today and to have these spaces, because they didn't give up. And I think when you're being bashed over the head all the time with, you know, extreme Islamophobia, extreme, you know, anti-Palestinian racism, extreme racism just in general, you know, all the time, and this idea that, you know, Western civilization or Western, you know, we have to show them what democracies, what these values are, that in that moment like that, it was very difficult to come out. It was very difficult to, you know, to say I'm Jewish and I'm pro-Palestinian.
You mentioned the word community, and I'll speak as personal experience. My experiences with the Jewish community. I worked with a Jewish person, and I'm pretty sure we had different political ideologies. I'm pretty sure he was a Zionist. But what I found, coming from not a secular but a religious family, what I found beautiful about how he acted was how faithful he was to his faith. Mm-hmm. Considering I had a very religious father, a very religious mother, I appreciated that side of him, right? Mm-hmm. And now we've never discussed politics, and he was always respectful to me. Mm-hmm. I always appreciated that side of him. Now, my second experience, and it gets back to you, is I used to work at a place where you had name tags, right? And for whatever reason, I had lost my Mustafa name tag. So I found a name tag. It was David. So I put on David and I went to work. And I remember a Jewish person came up to me. And I say this, by the way, and I found that beautiful too, right? He came up to me and looked at me. He's like, David, how are you? And I'm like, I'm not going to explain. And he's like, I'm good. And he's like, by the way, if you need anything, we're here to help. Here's my card. And we're going to help you out. And we're going to take care of you and whatnot. So obviously, I mean, I'm a Semite at the end of the day. If you name me David, I could look like a Jew. It's not that hard. And I come from that area. It's not that difficult. But the reason I said that story is that I'm assuming, however, that level of support comes with a certain expectation that you're going to follow a certain path. Or am I wrong?
For sure, 100%. I think that it's difficult when you're a Jew in certain sectors, in certain trades. You can get a lot of support from the community. I think that's very, very important. And if you don't follow the route, you can also be completely denied and completely turned away from the community. I think we're at a threshold moment, though. I think we're at a moment where there's no going back after this. There's no going back after the genocide we've seen live, 300 days. I think even the most staunch Zionists deep down inside know what's happening is wrong, right? They won't say it openly, but they know it because as human beings, we all know that what's happening is wrong, right? I think that the story that you told the two stories are interesting, I think the connection between Islam and Judaism since the times of Prophet Muhammad were very, very important. Prophet Muhammad, Ramadan comes from Yom Kippur, right? When one of the tribes in Medina, if I'm not mistaken, takes Prophet Muhammad in. And to respect it was around the time of Yom Kippur, to thank them, Prophet Muhammad tells all of his followers to fast with them. So, and then that becomes greater, and it becomes the month of Ramadan after. But it was from the traditional Yom Kippur, which was fasting, right? And in Christianity, you have fasting too. It's not the same fasting. It's not a whole fasting, right? You had the same fasting, which is doing Lent, right? So all of the Abrahamic religions have connections, right? And I think that there's also this idea within Judaism that, and in Islam, I know that too, that there's the people of the book, right? It's important that, we have respect for the people of the book. I think we should have respect for all religions, but I know that there is that connection, that very, very strong connection. And I mean, in many ways, kosher, halal, on so many different levels, there is much more connection on religious terms between Judaism and Islam than between Judaism and Christianity. Although we talk about, the Judeo-Christian civilizations, which is a complete invention of the right, because, extreme right, who are saying, well, these are backwards cultures that are not Judeo-Christian, and including the Judeo allows them to kind of whitewash whatever anti-Semitism they did in Europe and say, well, there's this fundamental hatred of Jews in the Middle East, which is not true. It's not true.
It's not only that, it's also the anti-Semitism that they still have. But
that they still have, of course. But it's like whitewashing it, right? What I find crazy is people like Mathieu Bocoté that have become the main, proponents of Israel today. Mathieu Bocoté, who is a white supremacist. He will never say it as such, but he talks about la théorie du grand remplacement, the great replacement, where, all of the immigrants are coming and replacing what is this great Québécois white nation, right? Québécois white nation that was founded on the genocide of First Nations. Let's not forget, But I think that it's very important to get back to the connection. When Jews are expelled from Spain and Portugal, they are welcome within the Middle East and North Africa, and a lot of Jewish communities from Spain and Portugal either go to Morocco, Algeria because there was already Jewish communities there, but they also went to Istanbul. Today, the last community that speaks Ladino, which is the Sephardi Yiddish, quote unquote, is in Istanbul. Sarajevo was one of the most important places in the world for the Sephardic community, and that was in the middle of the Ottoman Empire. So these connections are very important. And the other story you talked about, I think, is very interesting because even within the traits, physical traits, you can't tell the difference most of the time, right? They killed 4 hostages, I think it was a few months ago. Yeah. And people right away said, oh, it's terrible, blah, blah, blah. You know, obviously it is. The white flag and all of that. I mean, they do that to Palestinians all the time. They were only caught red-handed when it was hostages. But the fact that the Israeli soldiers couldn't even recognize that they were yelling in Hebrew, and they couldn't even recognize that they were Israelis, is maybe because there are Israelis that look a lot like Palestinians, because there are Israelis that are Jewish Arabs, right? That come from Iraq, that come from Palestine, that come from Egypt, that come from Lebanon, that come from all over, right? So I think that is very important. And I think that a lot of people here in North America don't realize that. I think on both sides, right? Like on the pro-Palestinian side, they don't realize that there are Jewish Arabs. And on the Zionist side, they really try to downplay the fact that a big percentage of Israeli society are Middle Eastern, right, and have connection, and they actually, had policies telling Jews that they couldn't speak Arabic, that they had to change the last names because if your last name was too close to Arabic, then you would have to change it. So all of that, yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned what happened to the indigenous people here, because I noticed on your pivot profile, it says he's a member of the Independent Jewish Voices and a union activist based in Mooniyang, Tiohtià, Montréal.
Yeah.
Now, I'm like, maybe pivot has this on every profile.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I looked at different profiles.
Yeah.
And you were the only one where that was written. So I was wondering, was that on purpose or it's just something?
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, the reason I want to talk about it is, one, you mentioned it on your profile. Two, I mean, I got a lot of flack during my interview with John Philpott about Quebec sovereignty and the fact that, you're saying Quebecers are colonized, but at the same time, what happened to the First Nation people here was pretty awful. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that. I don't want to sidetrack too much, but I mean, it's your interview, so we want to talk about it a bit.
Yeah.
And I mean, First Nations, Palestine, I mean, it's all related, right?
100%. Tout est dans tout.
Exactly.
I think that, so you said I finished a law degree. I'm now doing the bar. And when I got to law school, I felt completely out of place. Like I was like, I'm gonna probably quit. I've never felt like so, just like my social nature, like I could not connect with a lot of the students because a lot of the students come from backgrounds where their dad or their mom is a lawyer and their uncle is a judge and they've been in the legal profession forever and they went to private school and all of these things that I never went to, I never experienced, right? And one of the things I saved me was, I went into law because I wanted to give back and I wanted to use law to be able to change or at least contribute to change, concrete change, defend people's rights, right? Because I feel like we live in a society of rights, but most people don't know the rights and people take advantage of that. Authorities take advantage of that. The police takes advantage of that. Most people take advantage of that all the time. And Indigenous legal traditions really is what got me through. Because through learning about Indigenous law and Indigenous legal traditions, I always felt like, do you sometimes feel when you're in Montreal and you're in Canada, you're like, this city is not built for this climate. This is not how we're supposed to live in this land, you know? When it's minus 40 and you're still trekking to go to work and, you know, you can't get your car started and, you know, there's snow up to there and all that. And you really think about it and you're like, wow, like this is not how stuff should be, right? We should not be doing this. And when I started going more into depth into indigenous legal traditions, I realized, wow, there is a whole world, and obviously each and every nation have it differently, but there is a whole world of understanding this land and understanding Montreal and understanding the ecosystem that we live in and all of that in a way that is so beautiful, because it's like, okay, this is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of experience of the land, and they know how to take care of it, and they understand it in a way that we could learn so much from, right? And so just like, I think, for example, one of the biggest problems we have in Canada, we don't talk about it enough, is our incarceration rates. We have huge incarceration rates of First Nations communities. First Nations communities represent a little bit more than 1%, if I'm not mistaken, of the Canadian general population. There are upwards of 30% of incarcerated mates in Canada. 30%, yeah. In some regions, it's even much, much higher than that. We have situations where there are communities where it's, you know, you had the residential school system before, right, where we're taking kids away from their communities, putting them in residential schools. Most of those kids, most of them, a lot of them died. And we found mass graveyards and all of that. We have a similar system today, which is the system of criminalization. And actually, I mean, colonialism, settler colonialism, and criminalization of the people goes hand in hand. In Palestine, we talk a lot about Palestinian prisoners that can be picked up for anything, you know, administrative, for administrative reasons, you can basically pick up kids in Palestine and keep them under administrative detention forever. You know, you don't have to free them, and you never have to put them in front of a trial. Here in Canada, obviously, it's different, but the reality is that we're locking up poor people, and we're locking up Indigenous people. We're locking up people that don't understand, the system, don't get an actual real representation to defend their rights, and we're locking them up for problems that prisons can't handle. Addiction problems, mental health issues, you know? So for me, I said a little bit earlier, we get free when we're all free. There's no free if somebody else is oppressed, you know? In Canada, we can't possibly be pro-Palestinian. We can't possibly fight for the rights of Palestinians without taking into account First Nations, and it shouldn't be this symbolic thing. What really irks me sometimes is this symbolic kind of like we do land acknowledgements, or we come and we say, oh, you know, Palestine and Indigenous peoples the same, but then we don't even know what Indigenous people lives here. And so here it's obviously, you know, Tiohtià, I wrote in my profile, but you have, you know, Kanesatake and Kanawage, you know, the Mohawk Nation that are here. It's important to know the land that you're on and to understand the legal traditions, or at least the traditions, because these traditions, and we can talk spirituality, we talked about religion a little bit, they're all linked to religion in a way. And so for them, for example, the way of sustainable development, for example, for a lot of Indigenous nations, was within their religious, quote unquote, rights, traditions, you would have to give back to the land. You could not take from the land more than what you gave back. You had to have a sustainable relationship with the land. One of the most beautiful things I've seen in my life was Indigenous hunters, native hunters, going up and after they killed an animal, going up and thanking the animal and thanking the spirit of the animal for having given up its life for them to be able to eat, you know? But that seems cliche or whatever, you know? But it actually brings in this idea of, well, if you're thanking each animal because they passed away to give you the food that you're eating, you're going to take better care of the environment, You're going to take better care of the animals. You're going to take better care of that relationship. And that's what indigenous legal traditions explain to us, is that we all are in a relationship. That's why the teepees, for example, are in a circle. That's why the circle is very, very important with indigenous legal traditions, is you can't break a circle. Circle's always going around, and so we're all connected.
So it's like an ecosystem.
It's an ecosystem, exactly.
Yeah, but your story, I mean, it's pretty amazing. I mean, it's slightly different, but it's so close to kosher and halal. It's mind-blowing, actually. I mean, to get back to your story of fasting, I'm not sure, like, I mean, you mentioned something about the prophet learning something from Yom Kippur. Yeah. I know it from a different way. I know it was ordained from God, but I mean, that's details. That's regardless of what the point is. But I was listening to a podcast today, and the gentleman said, you don't know your religion before learning from other religions. Mm-hmm. Is once you learn from other religions, you know your own religion. And it's fascinating that even First Nation people, the way they slaughter their animals is somewhat fairly similar to how Muslims and Jews slaughter their animals. And how, like, for example, in Judaism and in Islam, you ask the permission of God, and with First Nation people, they actually thank the spirit or whatever they call, which is pretty amazing. That's actually very deep. And you said that it's like one of the most beautiful things you've seen, and I can only imagine that's actually, it's crazy how things are actually connected.
It's and you know, when I was talking about the fact that we don't do life right, right? You know, like in Montreal and Quebec and Canada in general, it's because these peoples have lived here since forever, and they know how to do that. So the struggles that you're going, and come to stupid things like starting your car and stuff like that, but just like some stuff like that, it's just like we don't live on this land in a way that is sustainable, and we have to learn from them. You know, we have to learn from First Nations, and we have to give decolonizing obviously our institutions, but also ourselves, understanding how we participate in this settler project. You know, a Zionist the other day told me something, like we were at Square Victoria, and he was really, really pissed off the fact that I was, you know, pro-Palestinian and stuff like that. And he said, well, you know, if you're for Palestine, why aren't you for the natives? Well, he called them the other word that I won't even say, because that just goes to show the understanding of these people, of these, you know. And I told him, and he was like, well, you're a settler here. I was like, we're all settlers here, you know. It's not something that takes away from you to acknowledge your position as a settler in Canada or in Quebec. It doesn't take away. It actually brings something as like humbling experience, right? To be like, okay, I'm a settler. Yes, there's been historic wrongs that have been done, and maybe within my life, you know, what I can do from the smallest to the biggest, well, maybe I can try to atone, to create relationships with First Nations communities that are more sustainable. And the first thing to do for me, and that's just a little gesture that didn't take any time, was to put Mooniyang, Tiohtià, right? Which are the two traditional names of Montreal, of this land. And obviously Montreal has probably had a lot of other names that we've unfortunately forgot, because every First Nation that all of these elders with their language that pass away, it's wealth that we lose forever. I think there's something like 21 words in Inuktitut to say snow, because there's different types of snow. You know, and we even see it here, right? There's that slushy snow. There's that snow at, you know, minus 20 when it's like, you know, so cold that it's almost can't snow. But it's like, you know, so that just goes to show that maybe, you know, for getting your car out of snow, if you knew the words, maybe you would know how to handle that situation. You know what I mean?
If you want to just go expand a bit on that, you said we're all settlers here. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, I mean, considering you're closer to me to that subject, and for me, it's important to be honest with myself also. How does a First Nation person look at me or you that lives in the city of his forefathers? Mm-hmm. How do they look at us? Mm-hmm. Do they look at us as settlers, or do they look at us like what exactly?
Mm-hmm. I think it's going to change, obviously. You know, it depends on the person.
Because the reason is most Palestinians look at
Yeah.
Israelis as settlers, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, I mean, there's a big gap in terms of like how many years, and maybe that will change. But the reason I'm asking is it's interesting for me to understand their perspective.
I think that, you know, having traveled in a few indigenous communities, you know, sometimes, you know, you get that, oh, you're just a white or whatever, which is fair. You know, I think that, you know, you obviously have to understand that, you know, there is this colonialism is still happening right now, right? It's still happening. It hasn't stopped. You know, it's still happening on most reserves. The fact that reserves don't even have drinking water, you know, is colonialism, right? And so anger is normal. I mean, who wouldn't be angry, right? If you're growing up with all of this intergenerational trauma, with you know, in communities where, you know, kids were forcibly removed from their families, put into residential schools. A lot of them didn't come back. The trauma that creates in small, close-knit communities. These are small, close-knit communities. Everybody knows each other, you know. One of the biggest communities in northern Quebec is Kibbutz, and Kibbutz, it's Inuit community. And the Inuit community of Kibbutz is around 300,000, 400,000, you know. So it's like crazy, right? It's nothing.
400,000 people?
No, 4,000. Sorry, 4,000. Yeah. 4,000. It's nothing, right? It's nothing, right? It's not even 3 residential blocks in Montreal. You know what I mean? So those are communities that are completely, you know, were destroyed by this, right? Were destroyed by the residential colonialism, all of that.
Was that planned?
Sorry?
Was it planned to destroy those communities, or it just happened?
No, it's so. I think it depends, you know, as the colonization goes, you know, but within Inuit community, for example, it was planned, and all communities have different histories, but in the Inuit community it was planned for them for forced settlement. So up until the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken, 1930s, they were still semi-nomadic. Inuits, they would you know, travel throughout the lands, live off the land. They would have the sled dogs, and they would live the traditional life that they have been living for, you know, millennium. And the Canadian government had a mass policy of sedentarizing Inuit communities, which was to kill the dogs. So they killed the sleigh dogs, massive culling of sleigh dogs, to make sure that the communities couldn't travel anymore, and to make them, they gave them houses which were not fit at all for the. It started in the 1940s and went up until, I think, you know, as late as 1970s, something like that. At that point, I think most communities were sedentarized.
What's the purpose of doing that?
It was to protect, quote unquote, the Canadian North, and to create cheap labor for military bases during the Cold War, to make sure that the Canadian Arctic stayed Canadian. With the Soviet Union on the other side, it was this whole idea of, we're not going to get a lot of people that are going to want to come up north. We have this population, but this population is nomadic. They don't stay in one place, so we're going to ensure that they have to stay in one place, you know? And that's one of the biggest tragedies of in Canadian history, is the culling of the sleigh dogs that a lot of people don't know about, and the fact that we forced all of these communities to stay in these community in sedentarized in communities, in houses that were not built for the climate. So you have a huge issues of 14 people living in a 2-room house, you know, with mold, with all of this stuff, horrendous living situations, and that's still ongoing. You know, that's still ongoing. So there's that. I think there's people that obviously is anger, but you know what? Most times I've spoken to First Nations communities, and it's like with Palestinians too. You know, I think that a lot of people forget that in this conflict too. I don't know what I would do if I was Native and I lived through all of that intergenerational trauma. I don't know if I was Palestinian and, you know, my whole family was obliterated. But one of the things that I have always seen within Palestinians is, one, determination, and two, this idea that they will prevail and that they will live free, and that's what they want. They don't want revenge. I don't hear a lot of Palestinians telling me that they want revenge. What they want is to live free and to live with their families. And so with First Nations, majority of the time, I don't hear First Nations people talk to me about revenge. What I hear is they want to live with dignity. They want to be respected. They want to have their cultures, to be able for their cultures to thrive, to be able to transmit their cultures to the next generations. And so actually they want settlers and people like us, you know, non-Indigenous Canadians and Quebecers, to take an interest in what this is, because we'll all, as I said before, we'll all live better if we understand the lands we live in, and that's only possible through this Indigenous knowledge, you know?
That's really beautiful. I would love to expand on that, but I think I'm going to need to sit down with maybe somebody that represents the Indigenous communities.
I hope you do, yeah.
So I can expand on that, because honestly, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, and it's only fair if I care about the Palestinian plight to care about the First Nation plight.
Yeah.
And for anybody that actually is living in dire circumstances anywhere in the world, we should give them a voice, and that's only fair. I want to talk about an article you wrote on Le Pivot entitled Le Terrorism d'Israël. It's the Terrorism of Israel. I found it very interesting, and I wanted to... Sorry, I'm just going to fix myself. You spoke about the definition of terrorism and how there's like double standards, basically. A state can engage in terrorism, but it's not called terrorism because it's a state. But when groups engage in the same or even less brutality, it's immediately called terrorism. You spoke about the terrorism of Israel. You spoke about terrorism in 2007, 2008, 2014, 2021, and we could go back from to 1948 and before that even, if you wanted to. You talked about how crime against humanity is a crime against humanity regardless of who does it. And you spoke also about the decolonizing the justice international justice system. What I wanted to talk about is, and that's something that frustrates me, it's that when we talk about two states fighting each other, it's fair to say that one is doing acts of terrorism. But when we're talking about resistance against settler colonialism, I feel that the word terrorism is used very easily against the people that are resisting when they're, en français, they're not sur les mêmes pieds d'égalité, and there's an imbalance of power. It's people that are usually almost enslaved, and whatever they show an ounce of resistance, regardless of what that resistance is, it's immediately labeled terrorism. And even though we can both agree that sometimes there are atrocities that can happen, sometimes things that should not be done. I mean, we can sit down here, grandmas and children should not be killed, regardless. I'm not going to defend that. I'm not very going to defend that. But I'm not going to say that the whole movement itself, resisting against settler colonialism, is terrorism. And that's what's happening in the West. And I wanted to expand on that because you didn't expanded on in your text, and I feel it's unfair because that's what's happening to the Palestinian resistance movement right now. Mm-hmm. Those people are trying to resist against settlers, and basically there's just either they're labeled as terrorists, and that's not fair.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I totally agree. I think that, one of the proudest moments for Jews, one of the historical moments that we talk about all the time is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, during the firebombing of the Warsaw Ghetto by the Nazis, by Adolf Hitler. And that was an act of resistance, armed resistance, but it was an act of armed resistance that was justified because, the Jews were going towards the gas chambers. There was a genocide happening because they were Jews, because they were whites, Europeans, in the sense that, obviously for Nazis, they weren't white, but their skin phenotype was white. So we look back on it maybe with, pink lenses now, and we say, oh, well, that was okay because, that was Hitler, and that was, but what did Hitler call them? Terrorists. Right? They were terrorists. They were scum. They had to be eliminated. They had to be destroyed. And this is what Jews did. Jews were going up, killing, the violent, blue, blonde-eyed, Aryan soldiers of the Third Reich. Right? And so I think that, obviously, as you said, the killing of civilians in any situation is a tragedy. Any situation. This week we saw, I think it was 12 Druze kids that were killed in Golan Heights. Israel used that as a means to go against Hezbollah. Beirut was striked today. But they're not Israelis. And there's a reason why the Iron Dome doesn't defend the Druze community in the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan Heights, which is part of Syria, actually. Because they don't care about the Jews.
Regarding that event specifically, however, I found it interesting that in the news, not a lot of people said that Hezbollah denied that they actually fired those rockets, right? And it's used as a pretext when Netanyahu is in the United States talking to Trump and Joe Biden to attack. Like you said, they struck Beirut today.
Yeah, I don't know what happened, to be honest. I'm not going to, as most of things with the fog of war, we're not going to know probably what happened. It's obviously, as you said, I think they used it in a way that was absolutely despicable when that the community itself, when Smotrich and Netanyahu went there, they were heckled out of the community because they didn't want them, because they said it was because of them. And it is because of them. They are genocidal maniacs. We have somebody, Netanyahu, in power, that wants to be in power no matter what, that will do anything to be in power, and he will continue to commit atrocious crimes against humanity, atrocious, crimes such as genocide, and to keep on to power. So now that it is obvious there will be no military victory in Gaza, it was obvious from the beginning, but there will be no military victory. They will not be capable of getting Sinwar. They will not be capable of getting the Hamas, the leaders of Hamas. Anyways, we're never in Gaza to begin with, in Egypt and in Syria, So now he's thinking, okay, the election is around the corner. Once this dies down, once Gaza dies down and we're not committing genocide anymore, people are going to call for an election. And what we know within Israeli history is that every time Israel was, defeated militarily, the people that were responsible, quote unquote, for that military defeat did not fare well in the elections. We're talking about, Moshe Dayan after 1972, the Yom Kippur War, where Israel was completely overwhelmed by Syrians and Egypt.
Even after any atrocities, what happened after Sabra and Shatila, right? There was a major investigation in the Israeli society of what was Ariel Sharon doing exactly encircling that camp, letting the...
He was still elected, though, which shows...
Seriously?
Yeah. Ariel Sharon was...
No, he was elected in 2000, but he was part
of
a big investigation in 1980.
Yeah, but the fact is that for me, I don't have much hope in Israeli society, to be honest, because it's sad, but it's the reality is that we have, I used it on Radio Canada, the expression of cuvé. On a cuvé the extreme right. We coddled them. We built them. We watered them like a little plant. And now we have a monster, which is the extreme right in Israel, where you have Jewish supremacists such as Ben Gvir.
Didn't you see yesterday they were debating if raping the victims
Yeah,
was fine?
I know.
That's insane.
And
That's
there were protests.
That's
Yeah.
really insane. Like
Yeah.
that society like went like at a place where I would have never expected any society to go to. Right? It's demented. Like
I think that you're in a context where everything goes. Right? So, like, we have not given them any red lines. We have not told them that was enough. Rafah was supposed to be the red line. We did not stop them there. They continued. They have now displaced certain people in Gaza 30 times, and there's right now, the estimates are completely not the real estimates. I mean, we're probably upwards of 90,000 civilians that have been killed in Gaza. And that is a genocide. Right, that is a genocide. There's 2 million people living in Gaza. That percentage-wise, it's unheard of. Percentage-wise, it's unheard of children that have died. Right. So what is that, if not terrorism? Right. What is that, if not exactly what they depict? Islamic terrorism or whatever, the worst nightmares that they created, right, with ISIS, with all of this. Oh, they're going to come, they're going to massacre everybody. It's going to be hordes of, Islamic terrorists coming into Europe, like some extreme right-wing figures say. Well, they're actually doing it in Gaza. And I mean, the history of Western colonialism has always been, mass murder. The Nazis, the Germans, the Nazis learned from German experience in Namibia, right, where they completely destroyed the Haro, almost entirely, a whole African population completely destroyed. They put them in concentration camps. I mean, these are all things, right, that have been learned, that are history, that are the experience, right, and to come back to the right of resistance under international law, there is a right of resistance. Regardless of what anybody says, Palestinians in occupied territories, which, by the way, on the 19th of July, the International Court of Justice, the World Court, determines that Gaza too, because the effective control of Gaza by air, by sea, by land, is an occupied territory. So all of the occupied territories under international law have the right to resistance, have the right to destroy military targets. That's a right.
That's the problem I have with what's happening with legacy media right now, is that as soon as you put the label of terrorism, you lose the fact that, okay, those people have the right to resist. I mean, I'm pretty sure you've seen, do you condemn Hamas, Piers Morgan, right? And nobody has ever asked him that question are you for the resistance of Palestinians? He always says, I'm for equality for everybody. But I mean, he never said, I'm for the fact that they are actually resisting. And that's what scares the West, by the way, is that they don't want First Nation people, regardless where, to resist violently or peacefully, regardless. Peacefully, they're just going to quiet you down slowly but surely. And violently, I mean, they'll do what they're trying to do right now in Gaza, right?
100%. I think obviously it's fear. I think it's also racism. It's this idea of but we have the rights. Like, we're always right? We have the right to go into Iraq for no reason, to kill upwards of 3 million people for no reason. The reason that was given was the weapons of mass destruction that were never found. And we have the right to invade, to target wherever we want. The drone strikes under Obama were atrocious. Under Trump, atrocious too. We're striking Yemen, Somalia, Mali, Chad, you name it, Afghanistan, Pakistan, you name it, there were strikes, right? So I think that is the problem with international justice and international law. I think we're at a turning point. The decision that the ICJ put forth on July 19th is a big watershed moment. The decision that was put forth by the International Criminal Court to issue a request for warrants against Netanyahu was huge. But at the end of the day, the war against terror, which on the scale that it was and still continuing, is one of the worst atrocities to have ever happened, there's no warrants that have been issued, right?
I would like to share your optimism regarding the justice system. However, I mean, we saw Netanyahu get, what do you call it?
Applauded in Congress?
Yeah, applauded in Congress, although there was a warrant against him. And I heard about Macron saying, I'm against his policies, but he's welcome to come to the Olympics. I mean, how does the West feel comfortable with those contradictions? I don't understand.
I don't think that the West... And so this is the thing. I mean, you know, it's going to be difficult for me to make a case for international justice. I think that, you know, and I don't like necessarily Churchill, so I'm not going to say exactly what he said. I'm going to paraphrase it. I'm going to say international justice is the worst of systems, but it's the only system we have, and it's the only way we can go towards an ideal where if you commit a crime against humanity, you are trialed for that crime against humanity, regardless of who commits it. So if indeed there is, and I'm saying if indeed, because this is law, this is not, you know, this is not media, this is not propaganda, this is not, you know, this is, we have to verify facts, there's reports, if indeed there is a genocide in Gaza, which I do personally believe that there is, then there has to be an investigation. People have to be put in front of the International Criminal Court. Just like if there is a genocide against the Uyghur in China, then the Chinese authorities have to be, you know, taken in front of the ICC. And we could even say, you know, if let's give the context of, you know, crimes that were committed by, you know, Hamas on October 7th, if those crimes were committed, you know, if it is verified that those crimes are committed, there has to be justice too. It has to be applied to everyone, right? Obviously, there is a difference between what Israel has committed and what was committed by most, you know, the scale of October 7th, obviously. You know, there's a difference between those two. This being said, violation of human rights is a violation of human rights, right? Regimes are never going to like to say violation of human rights is a violation of human rights. You know, somebody, for example, is going to say, they're obviously going to say, you know, if I'm a leftist, well, I support Venezuela, and I support Maduro, and I support Hugo Chavez, and I'm a leftist. I support Maduro, and I support Hugo Chavez, and I believe in the project of society that they were bringing forward to Venezuela, you know, redistribution of wealth and giving it back to the poorest in society. This being said, if there are actual cases of human rights abuses in Venezuela, who am I to say, well, no, those are left-wing human rights abuses, so let's stop there. You know what I mean? I think the problem also is the scope of law. Most of the time, we in a capitalist system, we're going to individualize everything, right? We're going to individualize, so it's going to be you know? The International Criminal Court is individuals. It's not a system. So we don't judge a system. We don't judge Israeli apartheid. We don't judge, the colonization, occupation of Israeli territory. And so we're going to judge individuals. The problem with Israel isn't Benjamin Netanyahu. The problem with Israel isn't Ben-Gvir.
It's the Zionist project.
It's the Zionist project. But you're never going to have the Zionist project on trial. And so the other side of that is the fact of collective rights versus individual rights. And so we have, you know, at the time when human rights were pushed forward, there was a counter project that was brought forth actually by the Soviet bloc, which were economic and social rights, saying, well, yes, human rights, but what are human rights? What is the right to vote in an election when your vote is nothing compared to the media conglomerates that control completely the electoral process? What is your right to be able to free speech when you have to go and sell your labor to somebody and that person tells you, well, if you say X, Y, Z, we're going to fire you because that's not within, you know, our policy. So that's the thing too, right? We have, I think, the limit of international law is the limits that us as a liberal capitalist society have given to ourselves, which is prior to this, prior to the existence even of international law, there were forms of collective law. There were forms of law where it's you could commit a crime against the collectivity, and we have remnants of that, right? You know, the crimes can be so egregious that the pen, I forget the word in English, can be bigger because it's a crime against all of the community, not just against the individual who you did the crime. But we don't have collective rights. The one thing we have that is still there is unions, is the collective right to bargain, right? That is a collective right. But most of the time, most of our rights are individual. And so just to finish with the whole decolonizing international law thing, I think that, you know, the importance of having one set of norms for everyone is to say we are all equal and we all deserve the same things in life, right? That there won't be two sets of norms for different people. Unfortunately, and I think that is the most valid criticism that we have of international law, and hopefully that is changing now with Palestine after 90,000 dead, right? Which is sad. But is the idea that you have one set of norms for everyone, but on paper, but in reality, you don't. So in reality, it's only African nations that went in front of the ICC. It's only Bush was never put in front of the ICC. As you said, Netanyahu came to the United States, but the United States didn't sign on the Rome Treaty. So they want anything to do with the ICC. Actually, it's when you want, somebody said this one thing once, and it's like, I don't forget, I guess it's like a general kind of quote that you attribute to so many different people, but the quote is, if you want to see who is powerful, see who you can criticize. And so if you want to see who's actually stirring up shit, quote unquote, excuse my French, look at the look at the institutions or people that the Americans are afraid of. And the Americans are afraid of the International Criminal Court. They don't want to give jurisdiction to the International Criminal Court. And they said, because it creates precedent, because Israel doesn't have jurisdiction, the International Criminal Court doesn't have jurisdiction over Israel, but it has jurisdiction over Palestine. And so that means that, for example, maybe Iraq, let's say, could in a few years say, hey, you committed crimes against humanity in Iraq. And although the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction over the United States because you didn't sign on to the Rome Treaty, well, we have jurisdiction. They have jurisdiction over Iraq and crimes committed in Iraq, and we're going to go and get you for those crimes.
I'm not going to stay too long on this subject. I'm just going to push back a little on what you said, if I may. My issue, and maybe I wasn't clear because it's a fascinating subject and I get emotionally involved, is the fact that I'll ask you the question. Do you think it's fair to, I'm not talking about October 7th, I'm not talking about the Palestinian plight, let's say the Algerian War of Liberation or the South African struggle against apartheid. Do you think it's fair to say that those movements that struggled for liberation and equality, during that process, did some atrocities, to call them, to give it the name of crimes against humanity, and give what the French or the English of South Africa did to South Africans and Algerians, crimes of humanity? Do you think it's a fair equivalence, that term? You understand my question?
Yeah, I understand 100%. I do not think it's a fair equivalence, and that's why I was talking about collective rights versus individual rights. Today, you do not have So you have a crime of genocide. You don't even have the crime of ecocide. Colonialism is not a crime, right? Colonialism is not a crime. Occupation is a crime, but colonialism was put away, right? Very quickly, we said, well, they could ask for reparations for colonialism, so we're not going to do that because we have the power and we want to maintain the economic system. At the end of the day, law is in place to maintain an economic system that is unequal in place. And as long as that economic system exists, as long as the law is there to perpetuate an economic system of unequal redistribution of wealth, of resources towards Western countries, that is the imperfect law you're going to get. I do not believe that. This being said, and this is maybe where I'm wrong, and maybe where my ideas have to evolve, but for me, I try to put myself at the place of any victim. And that victim wants justice, Try to put myself at the place of the family, for example, of peace activists that were murdered on October 7th, right? And on the Israeli side, right? And those people that their whole lives, they fought against the Israeli regime. Now, those people might want justice, Is justice genocide? I don't think those people would say justice is genocide. And I think that is what, makes the way we handle conflict in society is what makes our societies better. In the sense that if we are able to have restorative and reparative justice, then we are able to evolve as societies. I really, really commend people to go watch this amazing documentary series. It's called Justice USA, if I'm not mistaken. It's about the criminal justice system in Nashville, Tennessee. And one of the last episodes is about a kid who is 13, 14, murders from a poor background, not going to school, and one day he decides to carjack a car. He takes the car and he drives the car and he kills this father and grandfather, African American too. They're both African American, and he murders like him direct. And so it's about this episode is amazing because it's about these two families coming together. And this family saying there are so many African Americans incarcerated in the United States that we don't want a young African American being incarcerated for something like this. Although he did kill our father because he crashed into him and didn't know how to actually drive. At 14 is kind of normal that you don't know how to drive, right? But we don't want him to go through the criminal justice system because we know what's going to come out of that. He's just going to go back to jail in a few years. He's just going to, there's nothing good that's going to come out of that. Or he's going to get life. And what is that for a 14-year-old, So they meet and they discuss and they go through a 2-year process where they meet all the time to discuss, and they actually have to come to the conclusion that, yeah, we do live in a world that is atrocious, a world that makes you do atrocious things, where you are bombarded all the time, right? With this idea that, if you're a man, that, this is masculine, this is whatever. If you are, any person nowadays on social media, it's like you have to sell yourself like you're a product, right? And so, there's all of these things that stem from the products creating us as individuals into products, and then we find stuff, right? We find nationalism, a flag, we find religion, we find whatever, and we go into that 100%. So to bring back to your question about that, I don't think they're on the same level, but I'm for pardoning people from ISIS. I'm for that. I'm for bringing families that went to Syria in Raqqa back to Canada, because I don't think that treating people as they don't exist, stripping them of their citizenship, treating them as if they're, disposable, is going to resolve anything. I don't believe in putting people in jail because I don't think that resolves anything either. You know, we just put things away and we think that that's going to resolve it. Well, it's not going to resolve it, and it's been pretty clear that it's not going to resolve it. October 7th happened. The genocide in Gaza happened. The people that have survived the genocide in Gaza, October 7th, the Palestinians that have survived since 1948, the occupation, etc., the destruction of their lands, the Israelis that are there, that are settlers, that have committed atrocious violence against the Palestinians. And yes, there is a power dynamic, and the Israelis are the dominating force and the occupying force. That's 100% true. But there is going to have to be, if it isn't civil war and complete bloodshed, a process of restorative justice. And that might be idealistic. That might be, completely, pink rabbits and Disneyland kind of idea. But it's the only way forward if we want peace. It's the only way forward. There is not a way forward in the situation where you have two peoples. In Algeria was different. Algeria, but even Algeria, I'm just... But comparatively speaking, the Palestinians and the Israeli Jews are pretty much kif. Yeah. And even if you look at Algeria, they were expelled. Those Europeans and all of that, they were expelled. And now look at what's happened in France, right? The extreme right, where they have their biggest bastions in France, is because of the Pieds Noirs. Is because the Pieds Noirs never went through a process of understanding, hey, yeah, we were the bad guy. But then after being the bad guy, what happens? That's the question where we stop. We're in a situation, I think, a lot where we're like, you're the bad guy, right? But what happens after we announce that the bad guy is the bad guy? What happens? What happens when somebody has committed a crime, has committed a felony? We all agree on that. What do we do after that? Do we have a process of trying to restore justice or restore both people's dignity, everybody's dignity, or do we have a process of putting the person to the side?
Don't you think when society goes too far with their injustices, it almost becomes impossible to do what you're trying to do? If you look at what the Pieds Noirs or the French did in Algeria, it was awful.
Yeah,
it was really
sure.
awful. It becomes muddy and almost impossible to be able to differentiate and say, oh, well, the Algerian liberation movement shouldn't have done that. And then, well, obviously the French shouldn't have done that. And it becomes almost impossible. If I put myself in the shoes of somebody that's trying to liberate his country, like Algeria, I'm like, what's that justice system that's trying to tell me what I should be doing? They didn't do anything. I had to fight for my life. My whole family was destroyed. And they're going to come and tell me, oh, well, you did this wrong? Well, look at these people. I mean, they stole my land. They stayed there for 100 years. They killed over 9 million Algerians. And like you said, it becomes almost idealistic, your approach. And I wanted your comment on that.
Yeah, but I mean, you look at what Algeria is now, right? And you look at what happened after the revolution. And I think that, the seeds of the failure of the Algerian revolution were sowed at that moment, right? I think that there's no perfect revolution. There's nothing that's perfect. I think we all understand that. I think that there was a lot of hope with the Algerian revolution, and I think that Ben Bella, a lot of the leaders of the Algerian revolution were some of the most important figures at the time in revolutionary circles. Everybody, like the Black Panther. Yeah. Everybody went to Algeria. Obviously Nasser in Egypt, but at the same time, I think it was the Cuban Revolution. The Black Panthers went to Algeria. You had Frantz Fanon in Algeria. All of that. It was a revolutionary hub. Algiers was a revolutionary hub. But I think that as societies, if we don't deal with the trauma, if we don't deal with that and through restorative justice. I think a lot of people see what I'm talking about and look at a courtroom and look at a lawyer and look at a judge and look at this, contradicting whatever, that's not justice. That's the justice that we put forward. And the justice is like, okay, this person is now going to go rot in a prison cell for the next 30 years. That's not justice. You know, that's a decision, but it's also, I mean, it's not justice in the sense that, like, do people really feel better that somebody's rotting away in a prison cell for 30 years? You know what I mean? Like, if your kid was murdered by somebody, you know, that's not going to bring your kid back. That's not going to bring, that's not going to make the trauma go away. That's not going to, you know, and the thing with trauma is that it festers. The thing with trauma is that it creates, you know, it festers and it creates afterlives. And the afterlives of trauma, most of the time, authoritarianism, fascism, are all of these things. What we're seeing within Israeli society today is the aftermath of trauma, of never having come to understanding, one, that Israel was a settler colonial project, obviously against the Palestinians, a settler colonial project internally against its own people, the Arab Jews, right? That the Falasha, yeah, Falasha, the Arab Jews, Mizrahi, but those are the most gung ho today for the Israeli project. Today, Arab Jews, Mizrahi Jews are the people that support the most Likud.
So the ones that live the trauma, or the parents that live the trauma, are actually the most right-wing right now, because they want to show that they're with Israel till the end, or they're...
Exactly, because they've been brainwashed, and because for them there is no way out. For them, it's, we can't go back to Iraq, we can't go back to Egypt, we've gone too far down this. The Zionist project has destroyed all of our roots and all of that, so we can't do that anymore. So they have to make the Zionist project work. You know what I mean?
Well, we can talk about this on and on and on. The only comment that I'll add was, like I said, I do not justify killing grandmas and children. If there was a just system, maybe I'd agree more with you, but sadly there's a system, like you said, that maybe killed over 3 million Iraqis on a lie and everybody forgot it. And that's why I think, at least from my side, it's very difficult to give in and say, yeah, okay, well, let's treat everybody fairly, especially when those people have been colonized for over 100 years. Mm-hmm. Now, to conclude, what does Niall think is the path to justice and peace for Palestinians under occupation?
That's a big question. I don't believe in a two-state solution. I'm going to be very clear about that. This is personal. This is not necessarily IJV. I don't know. IJV actually has a position on that, but I know that it's not a two-state solution. I don't believe in a two-state solution because I think one of the biggest cancers in the world is the nation state. I'm going to be 100% clear about that. The nation states, people identifying with their states over identifying with other humans, identifying with the flag over identifying with other humans. And maybe you as Lebanese, you can more understand it because, like, in Lebanon, it's very like you identify with one, you're either Sunni or Shia or you're a Maronite or whatever. And so it's not the same thing as, like, you know, for example, us in Portugal, it's one religion, right? And so everybody identifies with Portugal. And very, very young, I realized, because, you know, growing up loving soccer, loving football, loving your country, you know, seeing, you know, I had the great thing as a kid of growing up with Cristiano Ronaldo, who was growing up with me, you know, so seeing all of that, what we had never seen in Portugal before, made me, it's like, proud Portuguese. But then I realized, like, hey, the people that are really proud about Portugal are also the people that hate other people just because they're not Portuguese, you know? And so I think that, you know, we're in a very, very dark time where people go back to that. I mean, especially here in Quebec, that's for sure. And I am a proud Quebecois, you know, I say it, I'm Quebecois. And I think that, you know, for a lot of people, it's difficult to say that they're Quebecois, because, it comes with like an emotional charge. It's like, especially if you're not Québécois pure laine, if you're not francophone pure laine, you're not named Tremblay or Michaud, people are like, can I really say that I'm Québécois, But I think it's important, because I think that's the biggest obstacle. The biggest obstacle for us is to live in this world where there's so much wealth, there's so much stuff to see from everybody else, and yet you're going to be there with your flag, right? And so I understood very clearly, very young, that people could be 100% Portuguese with me, they could be Jewish with me, they could be Canadian with me, and yet we don't agree on pretty much anything. You know what I mean? Because I believe that we have to build systems that bring dignity to people and justice to people. And there's a lot of people that, as long as they have their, picketed fence, their backyard, their little home, they think that is all. And they think that the Rubicon is, you celebrate Canada Day or you celebrate Saint Jean-Baptiste, and you say that the first thing for me is Quebec and the first thing for me is Canada. I will never say that. I will never say the first thing in my life is Canada or is Quebec or Portugal or Judaism. For me, it's humanity. For me, it's giving dignity back to all human beings, all living beings, actually. And so in the case of Palestine and Israel, that's why I don't believe in a two-state solution, because I believe that all Palestinians have the right of return. That's something that obviously Israel's against. I don't believe in a Jewish majority in Palestine.
Nor a Jewish state.
No, obviously not a Jewish state. I don't believe that we can reduce. We're in a moment where we reduce everybody to their identities, right? We reduce everybody to being Jewish, to being Palestinian, to being Muslim. Within Palestinian society, there's the PFLP that I'm probably much more aligned with than Fatah and Hamas. You know what I mean? And there's a lot of people, for example, that I know that voted Hamas, and yet they don't agree with Hamas's political ideology at all, because they saw Hamas as the only party that was willing to resist against the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah, which were corrupt, right?
And that gave in on Oslo, right?
That gave in on Oslo, and that continued to give in, and Mahmoud Abbas, and Palestinian society is much more than just being Palestinian. Israeli society, unfortunately, right now, in this current context, very genocidal, very right wing. Also because I believe a lot of Israelis have left. A lot of the left wing. I remember when I didn't talk about this. I never talk about this in my interviews, but I met when I was 18 two Israeli ex-Israeli soldiers that were in Lebanon in 2006, and they were encircled and thought they were going to die and whatever, and they promised themselves that night that they would never serve in the military again and that they would never live in Israel after that. And so they left. And so at 18, I meet these two guys. They were maybe 4 years older than me at the time. And they were the ones that really put me on the path to being against, feeling like, oh, I spoke to Israelis that are absolutely against Israel, against Israeli apartheid, against the Israeli state, and I can be a Jew and I can be against that. And they told me, one of them was going to New Zealand because he was like, there's a lot of Israelis in New Zealand that, they just herd sheep and they don't want anything to do with Israel ever again. And the other guy was just traveling. He was like, I'm going to spend the rest of my life traveling. I don't want to ever go back to Israel. I don't want to ever be part of that project again. Again, these are people that grew up. They were both. One of them was Yemenite Jew, and the other one was Ashkenazi. Both of them grew up under Zionist propaganda. They didn't accept the Zionist propaganda. They served because at the time, if you don't serve in Israel, all of these problems with that you have as a refusenik. But they had the courage to leave and to say, you know what? I'm shedding this identity. I'm shedding the thing that they imposed on me, that as an Israeli, I have to do the IDF, I have to do my military service, I have to be proud about that. And that, yeah, Israel does that, but we do that so much. In Quebec, if you dare say, right, maybe we should be talking to refugees more than 6 months in a language that is not French, ooh, you're not Quebecois anymore. You don't love the French language. If you dare to say that Quebec and Quebec culture is more than just the French language. Wow. Like, but that's what we have to dare to say. We have to be able to say we are more than the sums of our parts. We're something bigger than that, you know? And that's what I fundamentally believe. So all of this philosophical conversation to come back to the fact that I believe in a society where Jews and Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims, Druze, all of the different denominations.
Christians. A lot of people forget.
Yeah, the Palestinian Christians. I know. I don't, though. I don't, because George Habash is a very big idol of mine. I really respect everything he did with the PFLP, and people are going to say, "Oh, you're for armed resistance, whatever." But
I mean, who wouldn't be for armed resistance?
Of course.
I never understood. I mean, wouldn't you protect your house? I mean, it's the same thing for your home.
But you know, people are gonna skew this into the terrorist stuff and whatever, and it's fine. You know, if the clips come out of this later on, at least I'll know, and I'll be ready to defend myself about it. But the Christians, obviously, and you know, you can create a state that is not based on just, you know, us being something. It can be us being diverse things. And you being and I think if there's any place for us to think about that, it's here in Canada. You know what I mean? So yeah, and I'll finish with the last thing, because this is something that really scares me for the future of the country that we live in. You know, the right-wing populism that we're living with Poilievre, with Legault, you know, they play on those strings. They play on the strings of you have to be proud, you have to be this, you have to care about your family and your house. And so I'm going to finish with this quote, because it's a very important quote, and I think that, and it's a French quote, but I'm going to translate it live because we're in Montreal. It's being right-wing is caring about your family, your community, your family first, your community, your nation, and then everything else. That's being right-wing. Being left-wing is the contrary. You care about the world, humanity, you care about your nation, you care about your community, and then you care about your family. And I think that's what we have to get to. If we want to live in a better world, we have to get to that.